welcome to this launch event for a collaborative undertaking known as the Caribbean Wildlife Initiative, and indeed the inaugural presentation in this advocacy series entitled Catch Me If You Can, a production of the Center for Biosecurity Studies at the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus in Barbados, where today's feature address will examine the biosecurity implications of Caribbean wildlife on health, border security, tourism, trade, and economy, a public lecture delivered by the Center's own director, Dr. Kirk Douglas. My name is Christiane Wolcott. I'm the operations manager here at the Center, and I'm pleased to be chairing today's opening proceedings. On a programming note, it came to our attention early this morning that there were 2 start times in circulation for this event. So we are aware that we may have lost some viewers on account of this, and we do regret this. But we are grateful to those of you who were still able to join us for the 1 o'clock start local time. And if you're aware of anyone who was unable to make the later start, please have them contact us and we'd be happy to share today's presentation. And they can do so by sending an email to biosecurity, one word, at cavehill.uwi.edu. Again, that's biosecurity at cavehill.uwi.edu. And with that bit of housekeeping addressed, I take this opportunity to especially acknowledge the principal collaborators on this initiative and their representatives, including the CARICOM Implementation Agency for Crime and Security, CARICOM Impacts, the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species of Wild Fauna and Flora, or CITES, the Caribbean Financial Action Task Force, FATF, the United Nations Environment Programme, and the Caribbean Public Health Agency, CARFA. And this is by no means an exhaustive list because there are several community-based actors throughout the region who will be integral to advancing the outcomes of this particular initiative. We also welcome to today's forum senior officers from across the UWI Cave Hill campus, as well as a number of faculty, staff, and students. Distinguished members of the Advisory Committee of the Center for Biosecurity Studies, you, our viewers, members of the media who may be present, and of course, today's featured speaker, Dr. Kirk Douglas. For those of you for whom this is your first time attending a CBS virtual event, we're certainly happy to have you, and we do hope to see more of you as we move through these programs. For others of you who may be what we might call crossover viewers from our quarterly lecture series, of which the most recent installment was hosted last Thursday, we appreciate your continuing support of our broader suite of offerings. And this really signals to us that we've started to build a community, and it's heartening to know that you're finding things that resonate with both your personal and professional interests. On a related and equally significant note, the Center for Biosecurity Studies is administratively attached to the Faculty of Social Sciences here at the Cave Hill campus. This limited series that the Center is running this month, comprising this lecture and the 3 panel discussions to follow on the next 3 Thursdays of the month, in recognition of the launch of this Caribbean Wildlife Initiative, is also our contribution to the annual month of celebrations of the Faculty of Social Sciences being observed this month. And we take this opportunity to extend congratulations to the Dean of the Faculty, Professor Troy Lord, and to our many faculty and staff colleagues in the Faculty of Social Sciences as we celebrate the work and collegiality that we here at the Center continue to benefit from on a regular basis. And now, as we start to turn our attention to today's feature presentation, some of you may be wondering, well, why would a Center for Biosecurity Studies be concerned with the region's illegal wildlife trade? And the answer is a multi-pronged one, because the issue is partly a food security one. What practices are people engaging in to sustain themselves, particularly if food sources are hard to come by virtue of cost, access, and so on. Additionally, it's partly an economics proposition. If there is a demand for alternatives to traditional food or protein sources, well, how is this demand being supplied? Through what means and mechanisms? And as we consider means, motives, and mechanisms, well, enter the criminal dimension of this discourse. So there are many layers to this. At the Center for Biosecurity Studies, our view of biosecurity is the science and practice of safeguarding lives and livelihoods. Any natural or unnatural force, whether biological, environmental, or otherwise, that threatens Caribbean lives and livelihoods is of necessity brought into sharper focus for us. And today, Dr. Douglas will seek to broadly unpack the issues at play here as he leads us into the public dialogue that our panels of practitioners, researchers, and policymakers will attempt to broach over the coming weeks of our further probing of this particular topic. Today's session is intended to be an interactive one, and those of you who logged in early will have seen an opening poll that we have running, and that will be available for a little while. And you'll hear more about how this will be done once Dr. Douglas gets his presentation underway. There will also be time for a moderated Q&A and comments following the presentation, and we encourage you to post your questions and comments in the chat so that we can have a rolling discussion. Now, there are many experts in their own right among our viewers today, so if someone poses a question in the chat that you think you're in a unique position to lend some insight to, please feel free. And that will actually help to make the Q&A session a little more efficient for everyone's purposes. And we want to assure you that this is a safe space and we want you to feel comfortable sharing and contributing. In the event that there are any burning questions and comments that we're unable to get to before we adjourn, these will certainly be noted for later follow-up offline. And now, ladies and gentlemen, to our featured speaker for this afternoon. Dr. Kirk Douglas is a professional senior scientist recognized for his impactful research in the fields of microbiology, infectious diseases, biosecurity, virology, and zoonoses. He holds BSc and MPhil degrees in microbiology and a PhD in medical microbiology, all from the University of the West Indies Cave Hill campus, and an MBA from the University of Warwick. His interest in this field dates back to one of his earliest jobs, which he held in 2001 when he was employed as a veterinary laboratory technician at the Veterinary Services Laboratory situated within the Ministry of Agriculture here in Barbados, before moving on to being employed at a Barbados-based international medical device manufacturer from 2002 to 2019. He published the first report of the isolation and genetic sequencing of avian influenza or bird flu viruses from migratory waterfowl species and serological evidence of hantavirus infection in humans and rodents in both Barbados and the Caribbean. He has also served on a regional committee responsible for developing an avian influenza or bird flu surveillance network in the Caribbean through CaribVet, a regional animal health network involving several global agencies, including the World Health Organization, the Pan American Health Organization, the World Organization for Animal Health, and the Inter-American Institute for Cooperation on Agriculture. He has authored multiple peer-reviewed scientific papers with almost 100 citations in the fields of microbiology, virology, biosecurity, infectious diseases, and zoonoses. And after an extensive journey with the institution as a student, he joined the staff of the University of the West Indies on July 1st, 2020, where he very quickly returned to his wildlife roots through his very enthusiastic pursuit of this initiative over the past several months. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Dr. Douglas to address us on biosecurity implications of Caribbean wildlife on health, border security, tourism, trade, and economy. Director?
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much, Christiane, for a very insightful review of the initiative and the context behind it. I want to also apologize for the error on the graphic that was circulated in terms of the time, but I reassure you that this presentation will be insightful, hopefully invigorating to everyone who views it. So thank you very much, Christiane. And I will now begin to share my screen so we can begin. Okay, so as the title of the lecture says, this is really going to focus on the biosecurity implications of Caribbean wildlife on health, on border security, tourism, trade, and the economy. So in this lecture, what we will be examining is really the relationship between humans and wildlife here in the Caribbean. And we'll first address the question, why is wildlife important to biosecurity systems? What are the natural and human threats posed to wildlife in the Caribbean? Also, what are the risks posed to humans by Caribbean wildlife? And what are the then consequences of each risk? So to explain why wildlife is important to biosecurity, we first have to understand a bit more about biosecurity. So we at this center view biosecurity as the science and practice of safeguarding lives and livelihoods. And this is done through the reduction of systematic vulnerabilities to biological ecosystems. So when you look at the world is one giant global biological ecosystem. And what biosecurity is concerned with is preventing the diseases and threats to lives and livelihoods. And within the scope of wildlife, biosecurity systems are, one feature of them is to reduce close and prolonged human contact with wildlife and their novel pathogens. And this is due to the interaction between environment, animals, whether they be livestock or domestic animals, and wildlife and humans. But at the center of the interaction between wildlife, all these problems stemming around wildlife, is the human activity. So we are a huge part of the problem with the activities that we indulge in, whether they be trade, whether they be travel, tourism, the built environment, pollution, etc. But we're also a huge part of the solution as well. And these human activities all lead to increased vulnerabilities within our biological ecosystems, and therefore biosecurity is tasked with the effort to protect life and ways of life. So if we take a look at the world in the global ecosystem, there are approximately 7.7 billion people on Earth. And there are estimated to be 1.1 million out of 8 million wildlife species that currently face extinction. So as the human population expands, we are encroaching more and more into the habitat where these wildlife species have lived and continue to thrive. But because of our human activities, we are disturbing and dislocating these wildlife species. The graphic on the left shows you the extent of that impact of human activities. As you can see, the Caribbean and the Latin America region, we have experienced 94% decline in monitored vertebrate species in terms of their population size between 1970 and 2016. And this is a staggering statistic. And this highlights the need and the urgency for this particular initiative to address the relationship between humans in the Caribbean and our native wildlife. And COVID-19 has revealed some seemingly hidden connectivities to all of these issues. And in fact, the genesis of COVID-19, the leading hypothesis is that it stemmed from bats and made its way possibly into an intermediate species, maybe a pangolin, and that's how it then entered into the Wuhan, which is considered ground zero for this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, that hasn't been proven. There's a WHO team currently on the ground in China, and they are launching their investigations into this. But we do know some facts, and those facts are the viruses and all of these zoonotic pathogens live in wildlife species. And they do so quite naturally and without any damage or reduction in health to wildlife species. But it's once we have encroached into their realm, then we are then exposed to these pathogens that we've never seen before. And so the global approach to these pandemics, these outbreaks, has often taken a siloed approach from the global laws the global treaties, even the global funding that is addressed or targeting these problems often occur in a siloed approach. But what is really needed is a multidisciplinary approach. And this is at the heart of biosecurity, and we at the center are acutely aware of that. And this information, this data comes from the WWF Living Planet Report. So what are the threats to wildlife in the Caribbean? And these are also threats to humans as well. And we start with the natural events. And this comes under the banner of climate change. We know it all too often from the severe weather systems that are inundated within the Caribbean. I believe even last year, we had an unprecedented level of activity within the Atlantic at one particular time. I recall observing 5 named storms within the Atlantic. Unprecedented, never seen before. So we are actually now entering a new phase with respect to climate change and its impacts. And there are also floods, droughts, or even cane and grass fires. And also the natural and geological disasters, such as earthquakes and also eruptions. And we know quite clearly that with the La Soufrière volcano in St. Vincent, and we all pray and hope that that doesn't reach the stage where it actually erupts. But that is also another threat to wildlife in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And all of these events lead to wildlife displacement and increase the human to wildlife contact. Second threat, as was alluded to by Christiane, one of the major threats to wildlife is the illegal wildlife trade. And globally, this is estimated to be worth upwards of $23 billion annually. And this is only if you consider these wildlife species that are currently on the CITES appendices. However, if you consider animals outside of CITES, this figure dramatically rises to almost $200 billion annually. Even the World Bank has estimated that this particular activity is estimated to be worth $1.2 trillion in ecosystem losses. So this begs the question, what about the Caribbean? Where are we in the global picture with respect to illegal wildlife trade? And we hope to answer this question. Now, this is one example of wildlife smuggling in the Caribbean. This is an example of a traveler coming from Guyana and going to New York, who was intercepted at the JFK airport. And he tried to make his way through customs with these, and I think the ladies in the audience will be able to hopefully recognize these instruments. These are actually hair curlers, and he quite innovatively smuggled each bird in one of these hair rollers, and he had 70 of these birds in a bag as he was clearing customs. And each bird is estimated to be worth thousands of dollars, US dollars that is. So he was actually going to make a large windfall were he to make it out through customs. And this raises the question of whether the Caribbean is currently a transit point, much like for narcotics, for South American wildlife to external markets in Europe, in North America, or Asia. And this highlights also the need for support for our transport and border security systems. And I want to highlight the exemplary work being done in the Caribbean currently by Nature Nurture. And this is an NGO in Trinidad and Tobago that has been laboring tirelessly to examine the extent of the illegal wildlife trade in the Caribbean. And we hope to partner with them also going forward. The third threat is wild meat consumption. And while this graphic is very jarring, this is actually imported wild meat. So this is an intercepted illegal shipment of wild meat coming from Venezuela into Trinidad and Tobago, because the demand for wild meat is strong in Trinidad and Tobago. So what occurs is that persons in Trinidad may source the wild meat from Venezuela, which is undergoing some economic challenges, and also the instability politically. So this is an opportunity for those in Venezuela to earn some money, and also those in Trinidad to earn some money for meat that is on the cheap, and then they will be able to disseminate it through the Trinidad market. But these animals, as you can see, are partially decayed, and this also raised some public health issues. And there are a range of different animals that are used and targeted for wild meat consumption in the Caribbean. The fourth threat is the normal legal commercial trade. And the risk posed with this is the introduction of invasive alien species as we conduct trade of commodities from lumber, pipe fittings, it could be even vehicles. In one particular case in New Zealand, there was a shipping container that was opened and they found a dead monkey, and this was lumber coming from Guyana. And so there are also instances here in Barbados where anecdotally I've been informed that these wildlife species are often found, or not often, but are sometimes found in shipping containers. Also, ballast water management, and one hypothesis is that this is how the lionfish species was introduced into the Caribbean. As ships moved through the Caribbean, they exchanged ballast water, and depending on the ballast water management practices, you can have the threat of invasive alien species entering our maritime environment. So these all lead to a number of vulnerabilities to biological ecosystems. And again, transport and border security systems will definitely need support to be able to effectively make our region safe and secure. The fifth threat is land use changes. And there are a variety of activities that we indulge in as human beings, quite naturally for regional and also national development, from mining to rural development to urban development, or recreational use, such as the development of golf courses. And all of these activities result in the displacement of wildlife. We have deforestation, as you can see here. This is a mining activity being done in one of the Caribbean countries. And so you find that you have deforestation, you have an imbalance in your ecosystem. And it also brings workers from in these particular activities into close contact with the environment in which these wildlife are living, and therefore also expose them to hazards and risks that they would not normally be exposed to. So what are the biosecurity risks as it concerns wildlife? What can go wrong? How is it likely? How likely is it rather, sorry? And what are the consequences? So you have the case where it's pre-incident, the incident has not occurred. We also have the post-incident, where after the incident has occurred. And we've identified 5 general biosecurity risks where Caribbean wildlife are concerned. First of these risks is the biodiversity risk. And the reduction in endemic wildlife species is a huge, huge, huge issue, as you would have seen from that graphic. 94% decline is a staggering statistic. And the Yuan island gecko, and I will give you a better example of that reduction, is one animal that was targeted. Also, the introduction of invasive alien species, we know from the lionfish, giant African snail, and curiously, the green iguana and Cuban tree frog in Dominica. And this occurred during the Hurricane Maria relief, where there were boats bringing relief supplies to Dominica, but also hitching a ride on these vessels were these particular animals. And so you had the introduction of these animals during Hurricane Maria. There's also the loss of ecosystems. And you may ask the question, what is ecosystem service? Ecosystem service, for instance, if you have an animal that is responsible for seed dispersal within an ecosystem, and then that population is rapidly decimated, then you no longer have a seed disperser within your ecosystem to disperse your seeds, and then your reforestation or your revegetation rates will reduce dramatically too as well. But it is not all doom and gloom. We also have the opportunity to use our current biodiversity to our advantage. And a term to coin for this is the bioeconomy, and how we can leverage our bioeconomy, our biodiversity to our benefit here in the Caribbean. So this is one example, staggering example, of the decline in wildlife populations. And this is an example of the Union Island gecko that was only discovered in St. Vincent in 2005. But between 2010 and 2018, what we saw was an 80%, that's 80% decline in population numbers. And one mating pair of the Union Island gecko at the maximum price can fetch you $1,500 per pair. And it is the demand for these pets, these endemic rare Caribbean wildlife species, that drives the trade and smuggling activity. And there are huge exotic pet markets in Europe, in Asia, and in North America. Specifically with reptiles, it is becoming more and more apparent that Germany may play a significant role in the illegal reptile trade in Europe. But why do they do this? Because one, the laws within the Caribbean are very, very antiquated. And so even if someone is stopped or even arrested for this, the legal recourse that you have is not sufficient to imprison or even have a fine that is a deterrent. So there's a low risk, but there's a high reward if you are managed to escape the laws. And so it continues. So we will have to try to support the efforts of governments around the Caribbean to try to reduce this risk. On one noteworthy study was done by a master's student, Jason Noseworth, from the University of Cambridge, and he examined the Caribbean reptile trade here in the Caribbean. And he proposed within his thesis this theory of change within the Caribbean. And at the center of it, as you see highlighted by the red oval, is human behavioral change. So we have to change the way that we view wildlife and also interact with wildlife. So that speaks to the human to wildlife relationship that we have in the region. So what are the consequences of these biodiversity risks rather? Is the loss of endemic biodiversity, the imbalance of native ecosystems, the reduction in ecosystem services, deforestation, and an exacerbation of climate change impacts. Because the less forests we have, the less vegetation we have, what occurs is that the ability for our ecosystems to sequester carbon is greatly reduced. And this is high on the agenda of the climate change discussion. And this can lead to land degradation, flooding, as we've seen and witnessed recently in Barbados, and then also the concomitant maritime pollution, because as the waters run off the coastline of Barbados into the sea, then you get nearshore pollution of the coral reef system and the nearshore maritime environment. And this will also have an effect on our tourism product eventually. So this is a circular issue and a circular problem. The second risk, which is the public health risk, is one of the most popular and well-known risks with respect to wildlife. And it's estimated that 75% of new diseases start in animals. It is also estimated that 1.7 million undiscovered viruses currently exist in mammals and birds globally. And half of these have the potential to infect humans. So you see why wildlife is important to biosecurity systems. And in this graphic, it shows you the yellow area, shows you the high risk level that is attributed to the Southeast Asian area. And in fact, we've seen a number of infectious disease outbreaks stemming or originating from this particular area. But this also raises the question, what about the Caribbean? The Amazon rainforest is at the center of the global climate change discussion. And this, or part of this Amazon rainforest, is in Guyana, is in Suriname, and is in French Guiana. And we here in Barbados, as was recently shown on, I think it's on CBC, we are establishing links with all three Guyanas, these Guyanas being the normal Guyana that you know, Suriname and French Guiana. But they're also, because of their forested environment, also threats that we also have to ensure that we are capable of handling and knowledgeable of. These risks include the spread of zoonotic pathogens. So these are pathogens that pass from animals to humans. And these pathogens can be viruses, these are bacteria, fungi, or even the introduction of invasive vectors such as ticks, mosquitoes, and parasites, which can thereby spread pathogens and diseases. But what is emerging quite recently is also the reverse zoonosis transmission. And what is this? This is where humans infect wildlife. And under the context of COVID-19, this is becoming quite an issue. And there are a number of studies now being launched to understand more about this in terms of the ability for COVID-19 to jump from humans back into wildlife. And therefore, these wildlife could possibly serve as reservoirs. And so this is something that is currently being investigated globally. So I want to take time to give you a stark example of the vulnerability of our biosecurity systems here in the Caribbean. And this particular case is an outbreak of an unknown, unexplained fever. These persons contracted this disease, and they presented with hemorrhagic pneumonia, shortness of breath, moderate to severe respiratory syndrome. So no one knew what these miners had contracted. First, it was one person, then there were two, then there were four, and soon, before you knew it, there were 24 persons who had shown clinical symptoms. And of these 24 persons, 2 persons died. And of course, there were a number of tests that were done, and 2 of the patients were diagnosed with leptospirosis. And these 2 patients died, unfortunately. And these particular patients, I think the vast majority of them were Chinese miners. So this was a Chinese mining company in Guyana that was extracting manganese from within the Matthews Ridge area. And so these miners were airlifted from Guyana to China to conduct the autopsies in I think 2 of the cases, and then also to also test the samples from the other persons. And at the heart of it was histoplasmosis. And histoplasma is a fungus. So it's a fungus species that you can acquire from inhaling the spores that are present in soil or decaying animal fecal matter. So their exposure occurred because they were cleaning these old mining shafts of soil and the animal fecal matter, including rodent and bat feces as well. So what this led to, as you can see in the lower picture, is these persons had to be airlifted from Matthews Ridge to the closest local hospital. So we come to the public health consequences. These operations at the Matthews Ridge Hospital were temporarily shut down because they did not know what this particular illness was. It was unknown at that particular time. And what this does is it increases pressure to public health systems, which we know in the Caribbean are at the very best pretty fragile. And also occupational exposure to healthcare workers, because we don't know of these risks. And so obviously the healthcare workers, they would be, in some cases, exposed to these pathogens. It also raises the question about our border ports and their ability to handle public health emergencies. So for instance, if someone from Guyana was exposed, and thankfully it was only histoplasmosis, which was not human to human, there was no human to human transmission. But if it were a pathogen that had that potential or ability, then it would be a totally different situation. And if one of those persons from, I don't want to just single out Guyana, but from any Caribbean country, gets on a plane and goes to another Caribbean country, are our airports, for instance, able to quarantine and to deal with an emergency that may occur on an airline as it is, touching down at an airport? These are questions that we need to look at, and we have to plan for, because these things can happen. And when they do happen, they can cause economic drain on our resources. And also, as you can see with the healthcare worker pictured there, it is also taxing emotionally and physically on healthcare workers. And it also poses a reputational risk to the Caribbean as well. The third risk is the food security risk. And wildlife can also spread zoonotic pathogens to livestock. So you can have an epizootic, much like African swine fever, that is currently taking the globe by storm. And this can affect your agricultural sector. You can also have the introduction of invasive vectors, ticks, and mosquitoes or immature parasites as well, which can spread pathogens and also diseases. There's also the threat of mechanical crop damage caused by monkeys. And we know farmers have consistently and made complaints about monkeys, destroying their crops. But these monkeys have been displaced from their environment as well through the activities that I had mentioned before in terms of land use changes. And so this brings us into closer contact with them, and unfortunately results in these kinds of outcomes. So we turn our attention now to wild meat consumption. And there are a number of wildlife species that are targeted for wild meat consumption across the Caribbean. As you can see in the graphic there, they're actually sold in some supermarkets, and this is the presentation that you will see. So the concern with wild meat consumption is that the meat sometimes is not always prepared in the traditional quality assurance methods. And so there is a risk of foodborne pathogens and diseases being spread through wildlife. So this is a news article that was run in the Trinidad and Tobago Newsday. And there was some research done by the UWI, St. Augustine, where they found pathogens in local animals. And so the real risk with wild meat consumption is not necessarily in eating the actual meat. However, the higher risk is posed with hunting. So where you're actually in the forest environment and trying to either trap or kill the animal, and also in the butchering and meat preparation. So what are the food security consequences? As I mentioned before, the African swine fever is now epizootic that's taking the globe by storm. And there are a number of trade restrictions that can follow once there is evidence of an epizootic in a country. So this is mandated by OIE and FAO. And what this does is this reduces the food supply, and also it poses a threat with regards to food safety, as there will be foodborne pathogens. And this can have an impact on tourism, and you can have possible travel warnings that may be issued. We turn now to the economic risks. Now, FATF, which is the Financial Action Task Force, this is the global body that has the mandate of dealing with illicit financial gains and money laundering across the globe. And you may have recently heard of the different blacklistings from the EU for some Caribbean countries. And this is the body, the financial body, that is responsible for that regulation. And they have issued a report in last year, in 2020, on money laundering and the illegal wildlife trade. So it is possible that this may become an issue with respect to FATF and anti-money laundering protocols and practices in the Caribbean. Also, another issue is biopiracy. And what is biopiracy? This is where an animal or a plant is taken from the environment into another country and is used for the benefit financially for that country and without adequate compensation for the native country from which it is taken. And the Nagoya Protocol is the global protocol that seeks to address this. But the Nagoya Protocol also is rather weak in its implementation and also in terms of stemming these kinds of issues. So this is something that we have to be very, very, very aware of and very conscious of, because what can happen, foreign countries or organizations can come into our region, take these animals or plants, and then use it for their benefit without adequately compensating us for it. And so our bioeconomy is basically reduced. And there are also trade restrictions on agricultural outputs due to epizootics, as I mentioned, or even plant diseases. And again, the negative impact on tourism due to foodborne and other infectious disease outbreak, but also on ecotourism, because if your wildlife diversity is being reduced, then obviously your appeal of your ecotourism product is going to be reduced as well. So what are the consequences? As I mentioned before, the gray and blacklisting by FATF and the EU, the reputational risk, also the loss of revenue, because with these blacklisting come impact on your financial services and your appeal for foreign direct investment to support national and regional development, and also the potential loss of revenue in trade and tourism as well. So the fifth risk we look at is national security. Now, this is well known in other regions, for instance, in Africa, with the links to the illegal wildlife trade, money laundering and illicit financial gains. Also, the links to violence and other transnational organized crimes, such as human trafficking and narco trafficking, and also the possible links to terror financing and corruption. So what are the consequences? The consequences of this is civil unrest and political instability. Is this something that could happen in the Caribbean? We don't know. It is still yet too early to understand this. But what we do know is that we need to do something about it. And so at the Center for Biosecurity Systems, we've developed an analytical risk framework analysis. It's called PESHEAL. And this allows us to examine issues under the lens of biosecurity. And this allows us to assess, mitigate, manage, and prevent the vulnerabilities to major biosecurity threats. And it's multidisciplinary, and this is to drive and foster cross-collaborative thinking and collaboration so that we can generate comprehensive and inclusive solutions to safeguard lives and livelihoods. So this is an analysis of the situation with the Caribbean and its wildlife. In the political realm, we understand this and inadequate awareness of the risk that wildlife pose to lives and livelihoods here in the Caribbean. On the economic end, there's a paucity of data. We don't know enough about the economic impact of money laundering, trade restrictions, and tourism. Also, the economic potential of the bioeconomy in the Caribbean. We also need to examine more closely the social and cultural norms around wildlife issues, because in some Caribbean territories, a lot of indigenous people, this is part of their heritage and part of their culture. And so when developing policy, we also have to be sensitive to this. There's also a need to connect different sectors so that you can effectively tackle issues. And this will require a more stringent and better, technological advancements. There's also a need for tighter border security and biosecurity protocols for border entry, not only for humans as being done now for COVID-19, but also for commercial trade as well. And there's obviously insufficient data throughout the region on illegal wildlife trade and wild meat consumption. And we hope to target that within our initiative. With regard to the environment, sustainable and green waste management, because pollution can play a very significant role on the health of wildlife and also the health of the environment and ecosystem. And also how we do our urban and rural planning as well. And as I mentioned before, there's an issue with the indigenous people in terms of their cultural and religious norms, and also the view or lack of awareness of food sovereignty in terms of being able to provide your own food from what you have within your country or your region. And last but not least is the antiquated wildlife legislation that currently exists in the Caribbean that is deficient in addressing human and wildlife interactions and all the threats associated with that. So what are we planning to do about all of this at the center? Well, we have 4 major outcomes that we're seeking to have from this wildlife initiative. The first is to develop a Caribbean wildlife crime database. And what this database seeks to do is take a crime scene to courtroom approach. So the crime occurs in the wildlife or environmental management space, and we have to follow the trend or the chain of evidence from when the person goes into the forest, hunts that animal, and obviously he's hunting the animal because there is a demand. And that demand means that there is a product and there's a buyer. And where there's a product and there's a buyer, then there is an exchange of money. And therefore you have to follow the money. And that's the approach we will take. But also you have to build a chain of evidence, because if we are to get this situation under control, we have to have deterrence to criminals who will try to seek to exploit wildlife from the Caribbean. And this will include the financial sector and also the telecommunication sector, because these persons will advertise these animals or these products online. And therefore, we need to also follow the chain of evidence there. And we also have to raise the level of awareness for the court and judicial systems across the Caribbean. And we know that this will be challenging, because if a judge sees someone who comes into their courtroom with the charge of smuggling, I don't know what animal it could be, but he's also presented with several other cases of more serious crimes. His intent is obviously to do his best, but quite frankly, in his view and his perspective, this is not a burning issue, but we are challenged to change that view. And so we will be trying, and you will see in the next outcome that we're hoping to do, to change that view of the judiciary in the Caribbean. And how are we going to do this? We're going to do this through the Caribbean wildlife legislation reform. And we've actually started this, and we have a very competent group of lawyers that we've been working with from UNODC, from CITES, and also a regional environmental legal eagle that we have on board as well. And we've identified a number of areas where the current legislation for wildlife in the Caribbean are deficient. And you can see them there in this graphic. So there are a number of different issues that we have to address. And what we will be doing with this particular initiative, this particular part of the initiative is to generate this checklist for the persons who are within the judicial fields, but also to those who draft the legislation, because this will be a step-by-step checklist that they can go through to look at their current legislation and then make the necessary changes. Also, what we'll be doing is generating a legislative brief. So we will have a brief summary of the key issues why this legislation has to change. And we will be doing this at the CARICOM level, engaging the leaders, regional leaders from across the Caribbean, and also the attorney generals across the Caribbean. And there is currently discussion at the moment on the global front of how do we actually address a lot of these issues regarding illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime. Some suggestions have been to expand the current existing CITES regulation. Some have suggested the WHO's international health regulations or the FAO-OIE regulations. The third outcome we are hoping to do is to actually do some research that we can fill those data gaps. And we have coined it the forest to fork wildlife research. And this is done in conjunction with C4, and they have agreed to fund some of these research studies, the first of which is a wild meat consumption survey being conducted with Caribbean households. And we will do the pilot studies in Jamaica and Trinidad and Tobago. And what we will be doing in these surveys is trying to understand the COVID-19 impact on wild meat consumption in these two countries. And we're hoping to start that this month or by next month. The second study, which is connected to that, is we also want to then also examine the zoonotic transmission risk of this study. So we know that there are a variety of wild meat species in the Caribbean, but we want to understand what are the foodborne threats to human health in the Caribbean. So this will examine, in some part, antimicrobial resistance and also select viral pathogens. And we are hoping to launch this in July or in August of this year. And this will be conducted in Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, and Guyana, with the assistance of Dr. Rod Supal from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, and also C4 with Dr. Natalie Van Vliet. So the final outcome that we are expecting from this wildlife initiative is that we want to conduct training and education, because we need to raise the level of awareness and also increase the expertise throughout the region. And we'll be doing this through the provision of professional short courses. And we are hoping to have approval for 3 of these short courses in very soon. We have the one course, Biosecurity More Than Meets the Eye. And what this course will focus on is the risk management principles of biosecurity, how we define biosecurity in the regional context, using global and also regional case studies, and identification of critical professional sectors where biosecurity is of very high importance. The other 2 courses focus on wildlife and our relationship with wildlife here in the Caribbean. And the first of these is called Living a Wildlife, Part 1, and this will examine wildlife trade, border security, and money laundering. And this is an exciting topic that I know that a lot of persons will be interested in. And this will examine not only the global approach, but also the regional approach to illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime, and the different risks that are posed to Caribbean countries. And the second part of that, Living a Wildlife, Part 2, will examine wildlife, tourism, zoonoses, and pandemics. And this will examine the global and regional approaches to wildlife hunting and consumption practices, and the risks that are involved with these activities to Caribbean countries. So in summary, we understand that the human and wildlife relationship is very important to biosecurity systems. There are key threats to wildlife in the Caribbean, both natural and human in origin. There are also key risks posed by Caribbean wildlife to people. And at the heart of this is really human activities that really drive the emergence of these risks. So human beings in the Caribbean, we pose are a huge part of the problem, but we also are a huge part of the solution. Remember, I showed you the graphic with the study by Noseworthy that showed at the core of it is changing human behavior. So that is critical if we are to get or to improve the relationship between humans and wildlife here in the Caribbean. And that is really what this wildlife initiative is about. And we hope to then show that using multidisciplinary and a multi-sectoral approach, we can achieve this and close the vulnerability gaps and leverage all the opportunities that present themselves along the way. So I thank you very much. If you're interested in more information regarding the short professional courses, please feel free to contact us at bioSecurity@cavehill.uwi.edu for more details. And thank you very much. Back over to you, Christiane.
Thank you, Director. And again, we have quite a diverse audience here today, and we welcome everyone and their views in this forum. As a reminder, we encourage you to post your questions in the Q&A window, and I'll do my best to select from amongst those entries for this afternoon's discussion. So at this stage, the floor is now open for a few of your questions and comments. Our speaker will try his best to offer succinct but comprehensive responses. And well, we have a comment here from Mark Gibson. Thanks, Kirk. And you can share our website too, which is here for everyone's noting. That's www.nurturenature.tt.org. So please check that out. And we have a comment from Lyndon John. Excellent presentation. I hope this recording will be shared. Yes, it will be. And I look forward to the continued discourse. My question concerns advancing legislative reform for wildlife. The bottleneck in many instances appears to be the lack of capacity in the various Attorney General chambers in the region. How can this be met? Additionally, how can the governments be persuaded to prioritize wildlife legislation reform versus all the other pressing legislation that appear to be before Cabinet for consideration? Director.
Okay, thank you very much for the question, Mr. John. And this is a concern that was raised by myself also with the legislative group. We do understand that across the Caribbean, and this is an issue also raised by CITES in terms of complaints for a number of the Caribbean countries. And actually in the upcoming panel discussion, we will get into more granular details as it concerns this legislative reform process. And this will have Ms. Shamini Jayanathan, who's a senior prosecutor advisor at UNODC, Ms. Sophie Flensborg, and she is a legal advisor at CITES Secretariat. Also, Mr. Andrew Dalit, he is an environmental attorney. He's also an anti-money laundering specialist as well. And we will have Dr. William Scott Grob, who is the AML director at ACAM's organization. And those first three persons were critical, are a critical part of that legislative reform group. So we understand that the legal system is burdened with a number of issues, and the lack of complaints, especially with CITES, is not necessarily that they don't have a will to do it, but they lack the necessary resources to actually do it. And so that is why we took the opportunity to preempt that in order to make their life a lot easier. So it is a matter of putting together a checklist to identify the specific areas of the legislation that will need the reform. We're also investigating seeing if we can get persons from for instance, students from the law faculties who would be interested in pursuing this as a matter of research, so that they can also help with the drafting process for a number of these Caribbean countries, because we do understand that there are rather limited resources around the Caribbean. Regarding the impact and urgency of the need to reform legislative wildlife legislation in the Caribbean, I think there is no better time for us to raise that level of awareness right now in the midst of a COVID-19 pandemic that has purported origins from wildlife. If we are not able to see beyond the current pandemic to the actual source and what those reasons are, unfortunately, I don't think that this will be the final pandemic that we will be seeing. And I think the frequency at which we see these particular events will definitely increase as well. So it is incumbent on us and in tandem with those around the region to impart our knowledge and expertise and experience, so that the decision makers across the Caribbean are influenced to do what is necessary to safeguard lives and livelihoods across the Caribbean. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Director. And if it doesn't, we encourage the questioner to send us a follow-up. So we have 3 questions. One from Simon Boxall. Simon, I see you have your hand raised. If you could be so kind as to just enter your question or comment in the Q&A window, that would be great. Thank you. In the meantime, we have Fabiana asking the Director to expand a little on the process to identify the gaps and build the biosecurity framework model.
Well, what we've done, as I showed in the presentation, was an analytical tool that we developed at the center to be able to scan the environment to look for glaring gaps within the biosecurity framework. And that allowed us to identify some critical issues that we can focus on. We understand it's not going to be fully comprehensive, but we know that we have to start somewhere. And that is the reason why we are launching this initiative, because I don't see this as something that's going to be done or achieved in 1 year. I think that over the course of time, we will get better and it will become more and more refined. And therefore, we understand through that model that it's not going to be one issue. For instance, just changing the legislation is not going to be enough. Just having better border security protocols on its own is not going to be enough. We have to take a multidisciplinary approach in order to close these gaps, in order to make stronger biosecurity systems for the region. I hope that answers.
Our next question comes from Nicholas St. Hill. Proposals for addressing the legislation and educating professionals have been presented. My question is, what are your thoughts on educating the general population on the importance and relevance of biodiversity in the Caribbean?
Well, I think it's very important in terms of the relevance of it. We need to definitely understand how valuable our biodiversity is. I think we know that it's nice to be nice to animals, but I don't think we quite comprehend the value and how necessary they are for us to continue living a life that we cherish. I think that will definitely need improving. We will need to definitely engage more. And this is part of the engagement with these public lectures. This is how we intend to try to raise that level of awareness so that people understand. But also the economic impact. I think once people understand the economic impact of our biodiversity and what is really worth, then I think we will start to change. And as I mentioned before, and what I thought was very critical in the study from Noseworthy, we have to change the human behavior. We have to so to change human behavior, we have to change the way how people think. So we have to change the way how people think about biodiversity in the Caribbean, and that is going to be critical. And I know from around the UWI framework, CERMES has been for many years driving that awareness, but we are willing to work along with them as well to build out that, whether it be national awareness or regional awareness, as it concerns the importance of the regional wildlife and biodiversity.
Okay, thank you. Moving on to Khadija Hassan. Great presentation with respect to the regional development of a stronger approach to preventing and legally charging for illegal animal and plant smuggling. I would suggest contacting the Bahamas Environmental Science and Technology Commission that recently worked with several other governmental agencies, Attorney General, NGOs, CITES, to strengthen a national access and benefit sharing project. She says it allowed us to tailor for our unique experiences whilst also updating a legal framework and laws against illegal smuggling and outside agencies and researchers sharing information and monetary benefits for national use. Thanks for that contribution, Khadija.
Thanks very much, Khadija. And yes, you're quite right. And thank you for pointing that out as well. Sophie, who's part of the legal team, she did mention and highlighted that Bahamas legislation was exemplary for the region. So we are aware of that, and I congratulate you in the Bahamas for taking that step in terms of advancing your legislation reform. However, I think also what may become of greater importance is the issue of having these particular crimes identified as serious crimes. And the definition of that is that legally, if a person is charged and convicted of it, the sentencing, the minimum sentencing, has to be 4 years, no less. So this will take the class of crime as you would for murder or narcotic trafficking. And so it raises the level of which the crime is actually viewed, both in society, but also in the judiciary and the court system as well.
Thanks, Director. And another comment. I believe the hunter's source of income and livelihood would be impacted and should also be considered in order for the reform to be more successful. Has this also been allocated for?
Yes, most definitely. And that is a critical point, because remember I mentioned that the biodiversity of the Caribbean, of the Caribbean is part of the bioeconomy. And so we need to understand how we can leverage this. And for the most part, most of the wild meat harvested in the Caribbean is for subsistence. So these are persons who may not have access to livestock, or even if they do, their preference is for wild meat because socially they may believe that those farmed animals, they have a high level of antibiotics or they're very contaminated, but this is nature's gift that I can harvest and I can reap. But there are also inherent risks with hunting in terms of exposure to the hunters and also their dogs, and also the risk of transmitting diseases as well. But this is not to vilify hunting. I want to make that very, very, very clear, because hunting is, as I said, a social and cultural norm within the Caribbean. But what you want to do is to educate hunters of the risks that are posed to the activities that they may be conducting, and so that they can make themselves safer, and also by extension, persons around them safer as well.
And we have a question inquiring about funding for this initiative.
Well, currently we have some limited funding. We have funding from the Center for International Forestry Research, C4, and they are going to fund the two studies that I mentioned in terms of the well meat surveys and also the zoonotic transmission surveys, studies that we will be hoping to launch. So we know we can't do everything all at once. And if there are any funding agencies, for instance, UNEP or UNDP or any other funding agency, we are more than willing to engage with you and see where we can have some discussions and see if it is possible that we can perhaps access some funding for the initiative outcomes that we are hoping to achieve.
And Vincent Sweeney from UNEP is endorsing this as a very important initiative, and he hopes that this golden opportunity crisis can be used to highlight the importance of biosecurity and biodiversity in general to decision makers.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Sweeney. Thank you. I think, yes, it is very important that we make the links with wildlife and biodiversity and biosecurity so that the level of awareness can be raised, because people may not be doing what they should be doing because they simply just don't know. So it is important that we do inform them.
And congratulations from Carol Hull-Jackson on your presentation. I appreciate the One Health approach. Are the government veterinary service divisions across the Caribbean regions being engaged in these discussions? Also, legislative changes can take years. When does the team foresee these much needed legislative reforms coming into being? And is there a proposed time frame for this?
So for the first question, yes, we've engaged the government veterinary services divisions, and how we've done that, we've taken the approach to contact and work through focal points. And this would be, for instance, in the case of veterinary services, CarbVet. And people within the CarbVet network are all the chief veterinary officers who run the veterinary service divisions. So all communication that we will have with CarbVet is shared with the veterinary services divisions across the Caribbean. So that's our way of connecting with the veterinary services divisions. But we do recognize that we will have to, in some cases, then drill down. For instance, when we look at these pilot studies, we'll then have to engage those specific countries and their veterinary service divisions as well when we are actually conducting those specific studies. As it relates to the legislative changes and the timelines that we anticipate, so we want to finish the legislative checklist by the end of this month. As it relates to the legislative brief, which we will be tabling with the help of CARICOM, that will be tabled. We are hoping to finish that by June of this year. So we are working currently on that. And we do understand, as I said, there are going to be challenges, but we need to understand it's not only about the challenge, it is about the risk that it poses, and also, the drive that you have, and also the ambition that you have for your country and also for your region. So I think we have engaged a number of individuals on this initiative already, even though this is the first public launch of it. Behind the scenes, a lot of work was being done and a lot of discussions, and we had a lot of engagement, positive engagement of persons who took up their time and their efforts because they are committed to making this region safer. So I'm not deterred by the fact that it has taken legislative changes taken years before. I believe that we are capable of having a very strong impact.
Thanks, Director. And up next, we have Simon Boxall, who is tuned in from the Cayman Islands, and he thanks us for this presentation. And it's interesting to hear about trafficking of reptiles, but I would suggest that a far bigger threat relates to cats, both feral and pet cats that are allowed to roam. I can certainly endorse that. He references a study that was available in a National Geographic publication that showed that cats kill between 1 billion and 4 billion wild birds each year. In the Cayman Islands, we have laws that require responsible dog ownership, but cat owners often selfishly allow their cats to roam and kill endemic wildlife. This despite the fact that cats are much less likely to get run over, get ticks and fleas, get in fights with other animals, etc. Can we do more to advocate for responsible cat ownership? They focus on a handful of emotive cases of foreigners stealing through illegal smuggling, but cats, what can we do about cats?
Thank you very much, Mr. Watson, for that comment. Yes, I was aware of the article from the National Geographic where cats were seen or were purported to be responsible for the death of a lot of endemic bird species. And that is something, obviously, that we will have to investigate. But again, we don't have any data for the Caribbean. And so we would then have to generate that data to understand that. Because in the absence of data, then there is going to be pushback from the decision makers. How do we know that that's an issue for the Caribbean? That is only in that particular region. How do we know that for certain? And so once you have data, then I'm pretty sure that you would be able to have that. So you have to examine the issue. Okay, by killing those birds, what impact does that have economically and also for the ecosystem services? And you have to craft that whole argument in order to get traction and then hopefully impact to actually get that done. But I do take your comment. That is definitely something that we will then have to perhaps take on board and see if we can advocate for as well. Also, along with some of the NGOs throughout the Caribbean, as I mentioned, the Nature Nurture TT, and I know Mark he was on the call, and so perhaps he's listening as well, and we can work together to try to see if we can rid the Caribbean of that nuisance of feral cats and the impact they have on bird diversity in the Caribbean.
We actually have two follow-ups from Mark Gibson. The first one, a key issue in Trinidad and Tobago and other Caribbean countries is the lack of baseline population data to determine when a certain game species is overhunted and requiring novel or strict regulation. Would there be any linkage between your center and ecological research on game species? That's the first one. I'll let you take that one first.
Thank you very much, Mark. With respect to the lack of baseline data, yes, that is something that is a concern for us, because when we did engage with persons who are in departments with the responsibility for that, we recognize that that is a significant challenge in some Caribbean countries. There are some other Caribbean countries that do have that data. So there is a difference in some Caribbean territories. But yes, definitely we would be interested in collaborating with ecological research on game species. I know in Trinidad and Tobago, they do conduct some wildlife surveys, but we also recognize, I think in one particular country, Dominica, that the impacts of some natural disasters have a lot, well, not a lot, but in some cases impacts that. In the case of Dominica, what you had was the passage of Hurricane Maria, and therefore they were then challenged with conducting surveys, ecological surveys on biodiversity within the island, because they wanted to find out, what impact it was in terms of the population sizes, but they were challenged because obviously you're just being devastated by a hurricane, and so that isn't necessarily priority number one, or even if it is a priority, the limited resources that you have, even though you may want to do it, then you don't have the necessary funds to actually do it.
And Mark's further question, in what way might this align with past efforts to form a Caribbean Wildlife Enforcement Network, or CARIWEN, as a model for regional cooperation?
Well, yes, we were actually made aware of CARIWEN from UNODC, because when we were formulating the initiative in its infancy, when we collaborated with UNODC, they mentioned that there was a previously existing network initially, which we were unaware of at that particular time. So then we reached out to the individuals that were a critical pivot point for that in the Bahamas. So we are definitely willing to work with them. And for me, and also for the Center for Biosecurity Studies, we understand that this is not going to be achieved by one person, one organization, one country, but we really definitely need a regional approach to this. So all hands that can lend to the fight and the struggle of advocacy, and also of facilitating whatever research to obtain the necessary data. Definitely we are on board, and we are willing to collaborate with persons who share the view that we share, and we definitely want to work in a collaborative manner.
Thank you. Another question. Should hunting of wildlife meat be banned across the region? Surely this would solve many of the problems you've talked about.
No, I don't think that by banning the hunting and sale of wild meat will do that. And this is a discussion that's actually occurring on a global scale. We have the conversation about closing wild meat markets. And even though wild meat is being closed, for instance, in Southeast Asia, what that will do, if you think of it, it drives the rarity of it. So even though you may think that you're solving that problem, you may actually be, escalating it, because now, rather than, let's say, hypothetically, a goatee meat sells for, $20, because now it's illegal, but agoutis are still running around, then if someone wants an agouti, he's going to be tasked with paying a higher price for it. So there's that risk as well. I think what would be a better approach would be to be more interactive and to have conversations with all parties involved and bring everybody on board and see how you can make it safer for them to do. Remember, I mentioned that there are indigenous people within the Caribbean region. You have the Kalinago, and you have indigenous people in Guyana as well, in the Rupununi Savannah, who've been living like this for centuries. And for us to impose upon them to change their social and cultural and even religious norms, that is a key ethical issue in this. And that's why I highlighted it as well, because it is not a simple, cut and paste approach to it. You really have to look at all the full spectrum of it. And so, no, I don't think that will solve the problems you talk about, that we are actually discussing. I think we have to be engaging, and I think we have to come together to actually craft the most comprehensive solutions for these problems.
And a comment and question from Tanya Chase, great presentation. Within the CITES trade database, information regarding Caribbean wildlife is often quite sparse. Therefore, within this initiative, will there be any focus on establishing a robust reporting and monitoring program throughout the region?
Thank you for that question, Stephanie. And yes, so one of the first outcome that I mentioned and alluded to was the Caribbean Crime Wildlife Database. And there were 4 components that I showed, and one was the wildlife and environmental management space. And we recognize that there are challenges with CITES reporting. And this was highlighted by Sophie. And we looked to see how we could, kill a lot of birds with one stone, pardon my analogy, but the generation of data from the wildlife space is going to be important, but they are challenged by the systems that they have in terms of reporting. It is very laborious. And so I explained to Sophie that perhaps the will is there, but then you don't have the resources to do it. And I think from the discussion that I had with one individual, they gave me context of how long it took to generate a report like that. Because in some cases, what you have, and this is the interception report that CITES requires on an annual basis, is that all animals that are traded have to be registered in order to generate a certificate, but also if you have interceptions at your border security points, you have to note that and record it. So CITES is actually asking for that data, but a lot of this data is captured in books and log books. And so for a person to leaf through all of those leaves in the book to try to pinpoint these data, it is laborious. So what we are hoping to do as part of that database is to help to put it in a digital format so that it would be easier for the practitioner in the environmental and the wildlife space, but also leverage that data as well to inform and make the system, the biosecurity system work more efficiently. Because now you have data, that data can be shared with border security so that they know, okay, this is a trend that I see in the environmental space. So then also I need to be more vigilant at the ports for these particular animals or species. And then too, also the financial sector would also be vigilant to see if they recognize that a particular trend that they're seeing from within the financial system is also occurring, and therefore also to the legal system. So that's what I meant by connecting these seemingly disparate sectors and seamlessly putting them together so that they can communicate real time and in a meaningful and impactful way.
And so we'll just take one or two more questions before we close the Q&A session. And we have another from Lyndon John. How can we get the regional ministries of finance to factor the value of our bioeconomy as part of our national finance accounting systems, GDP and so, for example?
How can we do that? Again, it will come to sensitization. It will come down to raising the level of awareness. And so with events such as these, and also conversations and also studies with economists across the region, then we can, and that's what I mean by driving that multidisciplinarity in the approach. Then you sensitize those persons who are economists, and then you said, okay, you can have a green economist, somebody who is a bioeconomist, and that now opens a new field of study for our subgenre of the profession of an economist. And that is what we're trying to do, to try to flag these issues and raise that level of awareness.
Okay, and how harsh is the penalty for smuggling? And can you explain briefly again what biopiracy is?
Well, I think the punishment or the penalty for smuggling varies from country to country. And it depends on where you're taking that animal from. If you're caught for instance, in another jurisdiction with an animal, then it would depend on that particular territory that you're in. So that can vary from country to country. So I can't specifically tell you what the current penalties are for smuggling. What biopiracy is where you take an animal or a plant, and this is, for instance, a company or a country, and you take that plant and then you develop a product from it, or an animal, you develop a product, but then you don't adequately compensate that particular country. The problem with the Caribbean is, as the current Nagoya Protocol states, there are a lot of loopholes around it. And so unless you have, or what the Nagoya Protocol speaks to, it speaks to your existing legislation. So if your existing legislation does not demand that compensation, then there you go. You won't be adequately compensated. And we have a number of biodiversity species that can or have tremendous economic value. And these countries and these companies know that, but they also know that we're oblivious to it. And so it's quite easy to come in, take what they want, and go and make themselves wealthy and leave us with the damage behind. So what we want to do is also raise that level of awareness as to the importance and the value of the biodiversity that we have in the region. Because we, as Caribbean islands, we have endemic species, because as the native fauna have evolved, they are restricted in terms of gene flow. And so you will find species here in the Caribbean that you would not find any other place in the world. And that is the value of our biodiversity within the Caribbean.
So Director, as we look to wrap up this discussion, could you tell us a little bit perhaps about what the current surveillance infrastructure is, whether locally or regionally? How is this being managed now? If you see someone participating in these kinds of nefarious activities, how is this captured? How is it reported? Because obviously this initiative is a response to what is, right? So what are we really dealing with right now?
Well, right now, I would say in the Caribbean, we know that is occurring. There have been studies, not a lot of them, but there have been studies that have shown that this does occur. For instance, in the reptile space, we know that reptiles are being taken from the Caribbean and they're taken out of the Caribbean, in some cases to Europe. And what the individuals do is they take these animals and they then say that they're going to breed them. And so that's why they want mating pairs, so that they can now generate their own, I guess, quote unquote, farm of these animals that they can then trade. But the problem with that is that eventually they're going to have a lot of inbreeding. So that will require them to have new inputs from the environment that they take them from. The surveillance, and it is, I wouldn't say complicated, but people are aware that there are loopholes. So for instance, in Europe, and this is a conversation that we had quite recently with Sophie from CITES and also from Shamini from UNODC, some of the European legislation actually allows this. Not that they promote it, but the loopholes that are present there permit criminals to exploit it. For instance, in the US, they have what is called the Lacey Act. And that Lacey legislation speaks to the situation where any person who is caught on the US soil with an animal that is from another country, it is deemed illegal unless it is listed, I guess, under the CITES tradable animals. But within the European one, it is phrased differently. And what that allows criminals to do is to exploit the legislation in that regard. What can we do in the Caribbean? It is something that you have to change the behavior. Because for instance, if someone comes in the region and they're, vacationing, but they also are surveying for any animals that might be of financial benefit for them, and they go and tell someone, on the beach or that they meet, can you get me the 10 of these and, I'll pay you this amount. That person is not really going to check and say, well, is this, he's going to say, okay, well, that is what you're going to pay me for it. In most cases, what they're going to do, they're going to try to see if they can, because for them, it's just, let's say it's just a little lizard that, a common lizard in their house. So to get that level of surveillance, you have to raise the level of awareness so that people understand it is wrong, why it is wrong, and then what can be done about it. Right now, I mean, if, for instance, you call the police or you call, someone, then the most that the person could be arrested, all depending on the existing laws within a country. For instance, it is illegal to kill wild birds in Barbados. There's a Wild Bird Act. And so, for instance, when they want to do culling at the airport for birds because of safety for aviation, they actually have to write to the Minister of the Environment to actually get that permission to actually engage in that. So if someone is caught like that, then you have that legal recourse to do that. What are the penalties? I don't know. I'm not too sure.
All right, thanks for that. And as we close, I mean, of course, this is a collaboration, and I'd like to give you the opportunity to just tell our viewers who is actually involved and what expertise they bring to bear on this initiative.
So we have a number of different organizations that have lent their support, and we are very, very, very thankful for it. We have CARICOM Impacts. They are a huge partner, and they are the driving force behind the database development. So they are the regional part of the regional security system. And so we have been afforded the help of a number of database creative staff over there at CARICOM Impacts, and we're working together with them. We also partner with CABI as well. They are launching a border security initiative. They're piloting here in Barbados, and that is to look at the sea and airport and also track shipments and create different profiles that will help in terms of controlling invasive alien species, not only here in Barbados, but also in the OECS with time. So we are partnering with them so that they can help us obtain data for the border security initiative, well, border security component of the wildlife crime database that we are dealing with. There's UNODC, they're very integral in terms of the legal aspect of it. CITES, of course, because at the center of this is this trade is CITES. Then we have persons from different areas, the UWI family as well. We have persons from St. Augustine. We also have NEPA, which is the National Environmental Protection Agency in Jamaica. We're partnering with them to facilitate the pilot studies we're doing in Jamaica. We have EMA in Trinidad and Tobago, the Environmental Management Agency. We also have the C4, because they are critical to funding these first parts of the initiative. And I want to thank Dr. Natalie Van Vliet for her support in this initiative and for providing funding to get this off the ground. We have so many other persons who have engaged us and have contributed significantly to the initiative thus far. And we welcome those who have not. We welcome you aboard if you are willing to participate. We usually have 4 meetings every month, or 3 meetings every month. We've paused them for this month, obviously, because we do have a number of events that will take their place this month, but resuming from next month, we're hoping to get back into our schedule with those meetings. So if you're interested, then you can just email us at biosecurity@kfil.uwi.edu, and we can share with you the progress that we've made so far. And I just want to highlight that we have 3 more upcoming events scheduled, and they're scheduled for each Thursday at 1 p.m. The first of which is Living a Wildlife, Catch Me If You Can, Part 1. And this will examine in greater detail illegal wildlife trade and wildlife crime. So you can tune in to see what are the links between anti-money laundering and illegal wildlife crime, what constitutes a serious crime, and the discussion at UNODC surrounding wildlife crime as well and illegal wildlife trade. So that's the 11th of February at 1 p.m. The second Second one is Catch Me If You Can, Living a Wildlife, Catch Me If You Can, Part 2. And this will examine One Health, wildlife hunting, and consumption in the Caribbean. So we will have animal scientist from Cardi. We will have Dr. Natalie Van Vliet as well. She's been doing some incredible work in Guyana with wild meat studies, and she's also done a number of studies in bushmeat and wild meat in Africa as well. So come on the 18th of February, and all of these panelists will share their expertise, their experience, and how it then applies to the Caribbean context. We also have Dr. Rod Supal. He's a wildlife veterinarian, veterinary pathologist, and Dr. Tarja Sironen. She's actually part of a group that recently discovered a strain of Ebola in bats in Kenya. And they've been doing some really great work in Finland. I was privileged to actually be a part of their group when I was doing my PhD studies. So I know their work is quite impactful. And then finally, we have Catch Me If You Can, Living a Wildlife, Catch Me If You Can, Part 3. And this will examine One Health, land use management, and Caribbean wildlife. And this will feature Professor Julia Horrocks, Professor Chris Ura from the UWI. The other two participants at this time, we're still waiting for confirmation before we proceed with that. But those three events, I assure you that if you tune in, then it will be very informative. And I think that it will go a long way in helping us to understand what we have in terms of biodiversity, and also what are the threats that are posed by the wildlife species that we have, and how we can mitigate against those risks.
Thank you for that summary, Director. If you'd like to say one last word about the exit polls that we have running before we wrap up.
Yes, we do have a poll that we want you guys to fill out if you don't mind. This will help us to fine-tune our engagement with these types of events, and this will be sent out to you shortly. So thank you very much for attending, and we look forward to your support and also your engagement going forward. And we can do this together. We can make this region safer for all of us and safeguard lives and livelihoods. So thank you once again.
Thank you, Director. And as you would have heard, if you want to hear more about this series, if you'd like information on particular panels, particular panelists, please email us at the email address that you see displayed there. That's biosecurity@cavehill.uwi.edu. And we know that there are some people who are already inquiring about courses and so please submit your questions so that we can answer those as best as we can and supply you with the information that's available, because we're looking to launch some of those in the coming months. So we look forward to onboarding many of you who are here with us in some of those programs. And there are many ways to stay connected with the Center for Biosecurity Studies, not just through our email, but we welcome all of your correspondence. So we have a newsletter. The next edition is likely to focus very heavily on this particular initiative and related matters. So if there is a contribution that you think you'd like to make, by all means, send us an email as well to let us know what material you have, how it may fit with what we're looking to present in the upcoming edition or in future editions. And we also encourage you to visit us at our website. That's www.cavehill.uwi.edu/biosecurity. That's biosecurity is one word. And we, on behalf of all of our viewers, Dr. Douglas, we thank you for an insightful presentation. We know it was well prepared, and we look forward to having you lead us through the rest of the panels that are coming over the remainder of the month. So it's a busy time for all of us, and we hope to see you back for as many of the sessions as you can. We know it's quite an ambitious schedule, but we certainly do welcome you to all of these fora. If you are interested in catching up with what you may have missed, send us an email and we will get the recording to you and the presentations of the panelists and so on. So we are here to provide you with that information. So nothing will be lost if for whatever reason you can't join us. So again, the times for this panel, this series runs at 1:00 p.m. Barbados time, 1:00 p.m. But you can look out for individual flyers on each event that will follow as well. And we also take this opportunity to thank our technical crew in the background, Mr. Wesley Moore and Mr. Samuel Eugene, and the team of the Office of Marketing and Communications, who would have been responsible for disseminating the flyer across the campus community and so on, and for facilitating the director's appearance on Morning Barbados, if any of you were able to catch that. And wherever possible, please stay tuned for any additional outreach efforts that we're able to make on behalf of this series and this initiative. So on that note, on behalf of the Center for Biosecurity Studies, we thank you for joining us once again for this launch event, and we look forward to welcoming you to next week's panel as we begin to really dive into this area with our content experts and our practitioners and policymakers. So thank you once again, and do have a good afternoon. We're now adjourned.